Welcome to another episode of Tank Talks, your personal think tank for all things startups and venture capital. I'm your host, Matt Cohen, founder and managing partner at Ripple Ventures. On today's show, we welcome co-founder and CEO of Forma.ai, Nabeil Alazzam, to discuss building the best sales compensation structure for startups. Nabeil shares his journey starting his career in management consulting and how that experience shaped his opinions around sales compensation strategy. Next, Nabeil walks us through his experience with his first tech startup in 2016 and how he came to understand the real pain that sales leaders face when dealing with compensation conversations. We dig into why it's always been a struggle for sales leaders to manage variable compensation plans and how sales leaders can drive behavioral changes in an organization when a startup starts to scale. We also get Nabeil to explain how Forma.ai is helping sales leaders avoid the negative cultural impacts often faced by organizations when implementing new compensation plans. Lastly, we get Nabeil to share how his team was able to raise a successful Series B round last year after experiencing over 400% growth in 2021. But before we get started today, as our listeners probably know by now, the team at Ripple is always focused on helping our founders and portfolio companies find the best partners to work with. And when it comes to corporate finance and cash management, there's nobody we recommend more than the team at Jeeves. At Ripple, we manage all our fund expenses and employee credit cards using Jeeves. The team at Jeeves helped me get my team set up with physical and virtual cards in days. I was able to allow my teammates to expense items in multiple currencies, allowing them to pay for anything, anywhere, at any time. We weren't asked for any personal guarantees or to pay any setup or monthly SaaS fees. Not only does Jeeves save us time, but they also give us up to 3% cash back on our purchases, including expenses like Google, Facebook, or AWS every month. The best part is Jeeves puts up the cash and you settle once every 30 days in any currency you want, unlike some other corporate card companies that make you prepay every month. Listeners of Tank Talks can get set up today with a demo of Jeeves and take advantage of our Tank Talks special with a $250 sign-up bonus and skip the waitlist that already has thousands of companies waiting on it by visiting tryjeeves.com/Tank Talks. Use referral code Tank Talks to get set up today. Now let's jump into the tank for this week's episode with Nabeil Alazzam from Forma.ai. Thanks for joining us in the tank today, Nabeil.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on, Matt. Very excited.
Nabeil, I'd love to kick things off with a brief background on your journey into startups and technology and how you ended up launching your first startup in 2016.
I've been an entrepreneur since I was a child, and I think that was predominantly driven by the fact that I came to Canada when I was 7 years old. My parents immigrated from Syria, and obviously there's a lot of hardships and restarting of your life when you make that kind of move. And early on in life, I wanted to be as self-sufficient and support myself to take the burden off my parents as much as possible. And so I think my earlier childhood businesses were all about, supporting myself from a cash basis. And as I continued to grow in university, the business that I co-founded with one of my roommates, we had 8 employees, and I was doing that while doing engineering in Kingston, Ontario at Queen's University. And all my early businesses were around generating a cash flow for myself. But to solve a much bigger problem, and there's obviously these ideas, everyone gets these ideas of how to solve these bigger challenges and problems. What I realized was to do that well, I had to have the experience and the foundation. So I put my entrepreneurial aspirations to the side, got some real world experience as a management consultant, and then left to start my own business after that.
That makes a lot of sense. A lot of, immigrants come in with obviously a huge amount of appreciation and willingness to, make an impact and help themselves and their families, but also realize that, they need to have some sustainable income in order to get themselves off the ground and running. And so you chose to put the entrepreneurial journey on pause for a sec and spent some time working as a management consultant in Toronto. What were some of the biggest lessons you learned from that experience, and what sort of companies did you get to work with?
Yeah, I was fortunate enough to work with a management consulting firm that was very data heavy and analytical heavy. So I kind of was able to leverage my engineering background to solve some complex problems. And so I think the biggest lessons that I took away was that a lot of business problems can be solved using data, and especially in the sales and marketing domain. And I got to see some of the frameworks that were used to solve some complex problems for the Fortune 500s. And I got the opportunity to work with large pharmaceutical giants like the Pfizers, the Tevas, the Jansens, and the Johnson & Johnsons of the world, all the way through to chemical distribution organizations, travel and hospitality, and I got to see the breadth of how you apply sales strategy and how you design optimize sales strategy across all of these different verticals, and yet it was the same fundamental concepts. So despite it being different market segments, you're applying the same analytical frameworks to solving these problems. And so yeah, it was a great opportunity, great experience.
So you got to work with some of the largest pharmaceutical companies, and from my understanding, their sales processes and frameworks are quite complicated, and they have a huge amount of distributed salespeople working around the world for them. Were there any interesting use cases that you saw come out of your work with some of these large pharma companies that ended up changing the course of how they structured their sales organizations going forward?
To your point, we're talking in the numbers of tens of thousands of sales reps and sales organizations of that size, and so when you're solving and setting strategy, you're using data to drive at those decisions. One of the ways, historically, one of the projects I got to work on, these organizations would staff their sales team and support the physicians in the field based off of aggregate data within that geo or within that territory. And we were able to leverage data to enable the sales reps in real time based off of the physician's patient basis and their historical prescription to more dynamically determine which products were relevant to share with that physician or not. And so you effectively think about in marketing and how we use data in real time to kind of custom tailor the advertisements that you see. It was actually doing that for the field rep and making their engagement with physicians much more valuable to the physician. And I say this because in pharma sales is not really sales. And what I mean by that is, in a normal sales role, you're solving a problem for your customer. And you're solving a problem, you're asking questions, and then you're being a part of the solution. Now, you may bring in different champions from your organization to solve that, but in reality, you are part of the solution. In pharma sales, you're prescriptive. You can only say certain things, and you can only share certain data points because of all the regulations and what we can share. And so we're actually making the engagement with the rep and the physician much more valuable because we're enabling them to share only data that would be relevant to that physician based off of their underlying historical prescription and their patient basis.
It's really interesting the way you put it in terms of like how traditional B2B enterprise sales is not like pharma sales, and how kind of blind they are in the way that they're trying to operate, and how you brought data and analytics and some visibility to their role when they may have not had it before from their traditional setups. So after your time working in consulting, you put that on pause and got back into the entrepreneurial world, where you ended up deciding to launch your first startup in 2016 after working as a VP of sales for just under a year in 2015, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
So what were some of the issues that you uncovered during your short time as the VP of sales that led you down the path of wanting to launch your own startup?
The startup that I joined, the co-founder was my co-founder from my university startup. And so him and I had a pre-existing relationship. I joined to support the scaling of the sales organization. And at that time, the realization was the product hadn't, there was still some, product market fit issues. And so I supported, but in reality, it just wasn't the right time for me to help scale that organization. But in the background, I had just left consulting. I had worked with this customer, Stryker, Fortune 500 med products company. We had implemented a sales compensation process, supported them on their strategy work, and they had reached out because their existing systems that were implemented no longer could handle a very recent change in their sales strategy and their go-to-market design. And so they had reached out to seek my guidance and support. And so I supported them as a consultant briefly. And in that time, I actually, at the beginning of, I left Spoonerty to start my own startup. And for every month in 2016, I'd kick off the month with an idea, and I'd spend the entire month basically working as hard as possible to get to the no. And what I mean by that is, with every idea, it's market testing, researching, figuring out if this was the viable idea to move forward with. And in some cases, it was these were ideas where I thought they were very viable problems to solve, but I wasn't necessarily the right person to do it, or I wouldn't be able to generate enough resources or get enough resources, raise enough money as a first-time founder to basically effectively build out and solve those problems. And so what ended up happening was I had this idea of how to better solve sales compensation, and I had Stryker asking me for support. And so it was the perfect blending of both worlds where, okay, I can build a product to solve this, and I have a Fortune 500 customer that's actually willing to pay for this. It was a perfect, as they say, success comes when chance meets preparedness.
Wow, that's amazing. You were your harshest critic every time you came up with a new idea and that's kind of the opposite of a lot of early stage founders who have the, blue sky target or, bushy tail and bright-eyed optimism towards any idea that comes into your head. But I guess your consulting mindset came in first and sort of blocked that out from the optimistic side and said, why are all the reasons this wouldn't work? And eventually, as you mentioned, during your time as a consultant and as a short stint as a VP of sales, you felt the real pain that sales leaders were struggling with and decided to design a sales organizational structure and compensation strategy for one of the Fortune 500 companies that they were asking for, which is exactly why you're here today, to talk about why and how companies can build the best sales compensation structure as a startup. Oftentimes people say that employees don't need to be compensated for activities, but instead they just need to be paid for the results. But on the other hand, some people say employees need to be paid for their activities and the results will come. So to kick things off, can you explain what you mean by a proper sales compensation structure and what it's been a challenge for a lot of the companies out there for dealing with a building this right from the start?
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe to set the foundation, so incentive compensation or sales comp structure is meant to be your final carrot in driving the right behavior, right? So you set your sales organizational structure up front, you set your targets, your channels, you define your territories, you do all that strategy work up front. And then the sales comp plan is the translation of your strategy at the individual role rep level to the behaviors that you want to see from them. A great comp plan is going to drive the right behaviors such that when a rep games their plan to and optimizes their plan to maximize their own earnings, it actually generates the outcome that the business wants. The debate on where in the cycle of activity to reward, like results that you want to pay on, highly depends on how confident we are in the activity leading to a reward versus our lack of demanding that specific activities lead to the result. The way I think about it is, and especially in early stage startups, as you scale up, at the earlier stage, we actually know very little about what's the right incentive structure and the behaviors that we need to generate the outcome. And so you want a comp plan that's as simple as possible that rewards a rep with enough financial gain for maximizing business valuation. As the business scales and we start to have an increased number of roles, increased layers of hierarchy, increased product focus, that's where you can start tailoring and further defining the comp structure and adding more complexity and more components, because the result that we want from each role and each rep type is drastically different than others within the organization. And we can actually start to get more scientific and more calculated with what that comp plan looks like.
That makes a lot of sense. You're saying keep it simple, stupid at the very beginning and just try to maximize, valuation and overall benefit for the, underlying business. But as you get to have more layers in the organization and different areas in which people are being driven towards, you have to have a little bit more, not confusing, but ones that complement the different types of variabilities that are built inside the organization, which makes a ton of sense. The other challenge, though, that we see is that compensation plans are often confusing right from the start. When it comes to variable or base plan creation. So how do you recommend that sales leaders first understand what will drive behavioral changes in an organization, even before they implement any changes to their structure?
Yeah, it's a great point, Matt. And I think it's something that every sales leader should be pushing themselves to do, because you can't unwind a comp structure. It's very disruptive when you roll out a change versus understanding it before. Now, to go about uncovering the behaviors that lead to the outcome that we want, you can dive into the different, the variety of different sales processes that your team is running through and the types of downstream outcomes that we're able to see from the individual reps. And so, maybe just the best way to think about it is painting an example or putting an example into this. With one of our customers, one thing that we had uncovered was reps that renewed their customers' contracts 3 months or earlier prior to the contract expiry had a much higher retention rate. So those that had a higher portion of their renewals come in 3 months or earlier had a higher retention rate overall in their territory compared to those that renewed closer to the renewal date. And so if you're a sales leader and you're looking at this data, that tells you that the behavior of being proactive in chasing renewals actually pays dividends to your overall net outcome as a business. Understanding that first and really diagnosing, actually unpacking, looking at the data, making sure that there's not just a correlative trend, but actually the proactiveness of rep A versus rep B is resulting in that change, can then push you to make a proactive change to comp plans where we're going to pay more for renewals that are 3 months or earlier versus less than 3 months to the contract renewal date. And by validating that with the data before you ever make the change, it does two things. One, it makes it so that you're confident that it's going to drive the right behavior. And two, you can back that change up to the sales team with data. You can say, this is what our data is telling us. People who do X will have a better outcome. Therefore, we're putting this incentive in front of you to reward those who follow this and generate a better outcome. And by the way, by doing this, you're actually going to make more money.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. I mean, it seems common sense that you would create a behavior in an organization to go into contracts 3 or 4 months ahead of time before renewals are coming up and try to figure out a way to have a successful renewal. However, what you're saying is don't just implement changes and expect a sales organization to accept them unless you have the data actually back up why you're making that change or why you're implementing that new, procedure for the sales organization to follow. Correct?
Yeah, I mean, it streamlines and makes it much easier to communicate the why behind the change. And it makes it easier for the rep to see how this new comp structure is going to impact them. And hopefully they see it as a positive impact.
What about A/B testing when you don't have enough data to actually prove out that something will work, just to see if you can even collect data on the two different strategies around implementing changes? What do you recommend there?
I mean, I think there is an element of art and science when it comes to sales compensation. And so in some cases, you may have to, especially if it's a new product or a new space where you don't have enough data and we're going after. But then in those cases, you want to build the construct of the plan to be able to be dynamic. And so I'll give you another example to make it more relevant. If we don't know what good looks like, and this is the premise, if we don't know what good looks like, we're never going to be able to design an incentive structure that actually works. Because the whole premise with incentives, and this is something we didn't talk about earlier, is I want to pay the top performers multiple times more than the average performer, and I want to pay my bottom performer a fraction of what I pay my average performer. So I want to have a very steep pay curve. I want to pay for performance. If you don't know what good looks like, I may not have a pay curve that rewards those that perform well versus not. An example here would be if with one of our customers, they're rolling out a new product portfolio. And instead of specifying which products have which commission rates, so this thing about it as a distribution organization, so they actually have SKUs and hundreds of thousands of SKUs. So they're rolling out a new portfolio with thousands of SKU within it. Instead of setting the commission rates by SKU level and hoping that we're picking the right SKUs to incentivize a sales team, and then maybe not getting it right, and then changing the commission rates 3 months later, and then changing the commission rates 3 months later. Rather, it's creating a construct of a plan where we're saying, look, we have tier 1 SKUs, tier 2 SKUs, and tier 3 SKUs. And initially, our hypothesis is these are the tier 1 SKU products, these are tier 2, and these are tier 3. But at the beginning of every quarter, we're going to give you an updated SKU list. And so now I'm actually using the fact that I don't know what good looks like. I don't know what is the best outcome for the customer, but I'm building into my plan as a construct of there will be change. You're aware of this change. Every quarter or every cadence, you are going to assess this plan based off of this. And that's not changing the plan every 3 months. In essence, I mean, you could argue, yes, it is changing the plan, but it's not. To the rep's view, they understand at the beginning of every quarter, I'm going to go in, I'm going to look at my SKU list, and I'm going to game my customer activity based off that.
So you set the expectation ahead of time.
Yes, in cases where you don't know. Where you do know, because you have the data, it's much easier to be more confident with how you structure your comp.
It's also said to be telling your team what good and great looks like. There's a minimum viable threshold at which you have to achieve before you receive any compensation. And then if you obtain 100% or even more, that's when great kicks in. And that's when you get overly compensated for achieving better than good, which I think makes a lot of sense. But talking about sales compensation plans, they're often based on achieving or exceeding some type of annual quota. But however, when considering these compensation plans, there's always this game that's being played with annual quotas. So what recommendations do you have to company leaders when setting quotas, and what should they take into account when coming up with a game plan and implementing them?
Quotas are the lifeblood of an incentive plan. Like a comp plan is defined based off of the quota that you set. Again, to your point, you want to pay for performance, underpay for underperformance. If your quota setting is inaccurate, the comp plan is useless. And you could actually be paying the wrong people in your organization. And so instead of playing, we see this all the time where sales leaders, apply kind of a evenly, spreading the quota growth across their entire sales team, or applying a fixed growth rate year over year in the territories. When in reality, that quota setting process is so much more than incentive comp. It's so much more than the retention of sales team. It's actually about you as a leader knowing what good looks like. It's very hard to manage a team if you don't know the expectations that you're setting for them are valid. And so the more data driven you can be in quota setting, the more confident you can be that you're going to be better. You're going to be managing the performance of the organization properly. That means using data, market data, as well as historical, workload and activity data at a territory level to figure out what the potential is within the territory, the workload required to capture X percentage of that territory, and the historical performance against those potential metrics to help you curate and dissect what the territory's quota should be for that year.
So what you're saying is like taking all the data points from the bottoms up, so from all the way in the field, all the way through like the industry, averages and things like that, making some form of a quota analysis at the top level and then reversing that back down. Because sometimes companies either go just straight top down and they come up with like, their North Star metric or their quota at the very top of the company, and then they just push it down the throats of the sales team. Or the sales team bubbles up something that they think is achievable, and senior management either throws some type of a multiple on it so that they can show their board or investors that they're trying to obtain some level of growth. This X and Y equals Z is just so confusing, I think. So what is the best strategy you think for creating some form of a give and take between the boots on the ground supplying the data versus what the senior management team needs to achieve in terms of compensation plans?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good exercise to go through because it's going to highlight some faults. I think the bottom up tells you what is reasonable, and it supports your capacity planning. Because I think this is something that a lot of early stage companies fail to do. We see this a lot where the earlier stage of the organization, the less we actually think about capacity planning the way that we should be thinking about it. And what I mean with that is to set an overall number. If you have a repeatable sales process, okay, you set a specific number. You need to be able to actually demonstrate that you have the capacity to build it up. And that capacity is done from the bottom up. And so doing this bottom up exercise based off of the data within each territory, the team that you have, the capacity that you have, doing that, and then looking at the top down, that gap is going to start painting a real picture of what areas you need to fix in order to close. So ultimately, it's what do you need to do to close the gap? And in some cases, the gap isn't big enough where you could actually justify it by just spreading out the gap across everyone within the sales organization proportionally to their bottom up quota. In some cases, it may be that you need to think about adding another channel. Maybe in other cases, you need to increase the capacity within a specific team.
And just speaking about the complexity in regards to helping early stage companies, oftentimes companies' compensation plans are more complex than just a base plus commission structure and may include other motivating factors such as recognition and awards and trips and adjustments based on their region covered or product mix bonuses and all these different hurdles and triggers that they can obtain and more. So for early stage companies that are just starting out, how does Forma help get them started on the right path towards a proper compensation plan? And how does it help them scale over time?
we typically work with large enterprises. The early stages, I would say simple is best, right? So to the point, if you're just starting out and you barely have product market fit, paying a healthy but simple commission on ACV is probably the best way to go. If you're kind of an enterprise or B2B SaaS startup, because you don't want to overcomplicate it. You don't know what good looks like, and you want to tie it as closely to valuation as possible. And in the world of an early stage startup, recurring revenue is king, and so I want to compensate my reps for delivering that value. As you continue scaling and as you mature through the various stages of organization, as you get closer to that 100 rep size, now you're starting to build a repeatable, longer term sales organization where other business metrics matter, whether it's profitability, it's cost of the cost of customer acquisition, the long term attrition or churn of customers, and so now you can start factoring in these other parameters that defines what a good deal looks like. But in the early stages, it's very difficult to determine what a good deal looks like because you just don't have the end size to understand that. And so simple is best. As you progress, you can add these other metrics. Now, there's this misnomer that simple plans are the best, that you want to keep your plan very simple. You want to keep your plan very simple as long as it drives the results that you're looking for. But if it's very important that we drive X outcome, again, maybe it's really critical for this business to retain a contract length of greater than 3 years. We certainly want to put a stick in the comp plan to pay less if a less than 3 year deal gets signed. Does that add complexity? It does. Now the rep needs to think about one more thing when they're thinking about how much they're going to get paid for a specific opportunity or as they're negotiating the deal. But if it's critical to the business success, you need to factor it in. So the key is, it's not that a plan needs to be simple. It's a plan needs to be well understood. So you can have a complicated plan, but if you're able to explain it thoroughly, it's okay that it's slightly more complex. And I think that kind of goes back to, again, the fundamentals of communicating a comp plan.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Coming back to the confusing part of it, changing this compensation plan mid-quarter or mid-year can also have some short-term negative cultural impacts on people's behavior. So how can sales leaders avoid sort of the negative culture impacts on their organization when implementing new compensation plans or changing compensation plans mid-year?
When you make a comp plan change, you're effectively telling the sales organization that they need to rethink how they execute against this new comp plan and what good looks like for them. So if you recall back earlier in the conversation, talked about how the ideal comp plan, when gamed, produces the best results. The best reps that we've seen across our customers and my past life as a consultant, the best reps get their plan at the beginning of the year, and they'll sit down and they strategize and do an account planning for the full year to maximize their earnings. And so it is disruptive because when I give you a new comp plan, all of a sudden I've blown up your entire strategy of how to get to your on-target comp, and now you have to rethink that. So we do two things that drive a minimal disruption for organizations when they make comp plan changes. And I think it's something that every sales leader should think about. One, how do I make sure that the sales leaders or the sales reps understand their comp plan that we're giving? And two, how do I make sure that the reps understand the key levers that will have outsized returns from a behavior perspective? AKA, if I can help them understand how to game the plan faster, that's going to get over that disruption. Now, what's interesting is that compensation is a topic that no one wants to talk about. How often do you talk about your salary with, even a salaried employee? How often do they talk about their salary with their boss? They don't, right? It's a hard conversation to have. And I think sales compensation is very similar in that most leaders roll out a comp plan at the beginning of the year, and then they don't talk about it after the first week. After the first week, it doesn't get brought up. When in reality, we should be talking about compensation structure, like the comp plan, with every performance review. Anytime we're talking about performance with a sales rep, we should be thinking about, okay, here's where you are against your targets today. By the way, if you just do X, Y, and Z, you're going to hit that next tranche, and this is how much money it means for you. You constantly need to be thinking about the compensation as a part of the conversation because it's so closely tied. In most cases, reps, especially like enterprise AEs or enterprise account management sales reps, 50% or more of their compensation is tied to this variable component. If you're not talking about it in these performance discussions, it makes for a very painful long-term, especially if they don't understand the plan.
So double click on the sort of communication part of it. What advice do you have on communication strategies? Like, is this like in written form? Is this in, verbal? Is this in, weekly or quarterly updates? Like, how do you recommend the best way to communicate this? One-on-one, group settings, town halls, like kind of thing. Share with us your thoughts on the communication side of it.
Most performance discussions, I think you can have a team-wide conversation to talk about the overarching mechanisms, the whys behind, the structure, the overarching reasons why the organization went a certain way. As with most performance discussions, it needs to be tailored and individualized to that rep. And the more you can tailor it, the more you can discuss their specific territory and what they need to do within their business to hit those targets and make that on-target earning, the better. And so in an ideal world, you're communicating the whys with the organization, and then each sales leader understands the plan well enough that they're able to take their individual reps on the journey of what this comp plan means for them in their specific territory, what actions they need to do next to ensure that they hit the targets, and then what are the levers that can have a outsized impact. And what I mean by that is, what are the levers that they need to do to get to that 2 to 3x OTE performance outcome?
I love that. That's like saying how you were saying the best leaders do this at the beginning of every year. They build out their entire pipeline and their expectations on how they're going to achieve everything every month or every quarter, and you want to implement that into the culture of teaching all of your sales leaders to do that with their entire teammates on an ongoing basis, which makes a lot of sense. But I got to say, unfortunately, there's always going to be some winners and losers in the compensation world, where those who make the most money are the ones who are able to achieve quota and attain this. And then the ones who can't are obviously going to make less money. But sometimes there's those people who are just in a position who, make more money, but don't often get the value they think they deserve from the quota. And when they go ask for more, they don't get compensated for more and they get disgruntled and they end up leaving the company. So, how should leaders try and use the compensation as a motivational strategy that doesn't lead to attrition in the organization?
So, this goes back to the point earlier, which is you need to think about quota and targets as the definition of good. And if your definition of what is good is off, you're going to have all kinds of attrition problems because your top performers know that they're executing on their playbook. They've seen what they've been able to drive in other companies and other organizations, and they're seeing that they're not being rewarded for that, that behavior and that outcome. And there's a very, the strongest sales reps can get a job in any market, any time. And so I think there's a element of you want to make sure your targets are set right because you want to pay those performers significantly more than your average. And the only way to do that is to set your targets right. I think ultimately the winners of a comp plan, unfortunately, in some cases, are not the righteous winners because they were handed a target that was very easy to achieve, or they're handed a territory where there's a windfall that could have easily been calculated or taken into account, and that creates a residual negative outcome for the business. This is one thing that no one. It's not talked about often, but a bad comp plan and a bad quota setting process doesn't cost you that year. It costs you for multiple years down the line, because the second that a bad reps, like a bad performer gets, or an average performer gets the taste of that much comp, the next year, they're no longer happy if they get their average comp. And so a bad comp plan, we've seen it, has residual impacts 2 years down the line. And so this is not something that's something that you can mess around with. I think the impact of poorly run sales compensation is massive. I mean, it's not only the second largest cost center for most organizations, but it is the lifeblood of the revenue engine.
Yeah, I can totally see it. Like, I mean, I've heard that people who used to work at like Facebook or Instagram or whatever, like they wouldn't even have to pick up the phone and call anyone. The phones were just ringing for people to spend money on Facebook. And like they were hitting quota like left, right, and center as salespeople. It was quite easy. But then all of a sudden the market shifts and the tide changes. And then all of a sudden you go from being paid over quota compensation to average or even below. And then it just disrupts the entire organization's flow. and culture, obviously. Are there any examples that you can give us in terms of companies that you've seen really screw up their compensation plan? Not ones that maybe are former customers, but just in general, or ones that you've seen in the media, to give our listeners an example of like what a really bad comp plan can do for a company on the rise?
The best example I give is the impact in an organization where if you go through this process and you don't set it right, there's an organization that had a very steep pay curve, which is what you want to have, right? That you pay your top performers 2 to 3x your average and your bottom performer a third. But unfortunately, they didn't set the comp plan right. And so the mechanics led to half the team overperforming and half the team underperforming. And so even though they didn't even hit their business target, they had spent 30% more on their sales compensation budget than they had targeted for their on target budget business performance. And so if you're and these are large organizations, right? Some of them are PE owned, but in this specific case, that's a massive impact to your EBITDA, right? This is second largest cost center and I'm not 30% over budget. We're talking tens of millions of dollars. This has a massive impact on this business. And it led to not only pain that following year and the year after in terms of, as I mentioned, the sales team attrition and impact, but it also led to a valuation impact ultimately.
Yeah, we've seen this even with early stage startups who were really gunning for those large contracts, but their compensation plans were totally out of whack. They were like giving up 15% in the first year, 10% in the second year of the contract, and another 7.5% in the third year. And you were just sitting there like, wow, that's like tons of money just flowing out the door right off the top. And there's nothing left over for the company to actually show. And this is even before they were reaching profitability. This is obviously when they're still burning at the early stage. So a compensation plan can really disrupt an organization. Even when you appear to be winning on the top line, it can really take a lot out of the company. And then also set the wrong expectations for the employees who just joined because they heard that the compensation plan was so juicy that they wanted to come and be salespeople to work there as well, right?
Exactly. And that example that you highlighted is perfect. I mean, that's why we recommend paying on bookings even as an early stage startup, because the second that you start paying on recurring revenue or paying on year 2 and 3, what you've actually done is you've made the comp plan in year 2 and year 3 less powerful, right? If I'm a rep in year 1 and my book of business carries on to year 2, now my variable component is only, instead of being 50% of my pay, because I have money coming in from the previous year's work, now it's 40% of my pay. And by the time you get to year 3 or year 4, that rep is just making their money just by sitting there and doing nothing, collecting off of existing revenue. So 100%, it's pay a healthy amount. You're better off paying a higher percentage on upfront booking and taking that as a cost of customer acquisition versus carrying that cost and paying it as a residual basis.
Yeah, I remember companies that were paying on contract signed, not bookings. And that was crazy to see. And then also, if there was churn, you couldn't claw it back. Which is why they ended up implementing, a 6 or 12-month rolling close on commissions after customers had actually booked revenue, which makes a lot of sense. So, let's get into Forma a bit. Can you explain more about how Forma uses data-driven tools to bring all the components of compensation management into a single AI-supported platform, eliminating, obviously, the existing processes and constraints and bottlenecks we've talked about on this podcast?
In today's world, everything we've talked about, this design of compensation, is completely upstream. It's done by sales leaders working in conjunction with finance. And you do this process, you curate the plan, you're modeling it in Excel, you're modeling it in whatever financial tool you use. And then once you're done, you pass it over to your sales ops team or your sales comp team to execute on that payroll in an ongoing basis going forward. And to me as a consultant, what I saw is this disjointed nature between design and execution. And so with Forma, we wanted to solve this problem by bringing design and execution together into one platform. I want to use the same platform that I actually pay and communicate the performance to my reps as the one that I design and iterate and model different scenarios. Ultimately, the way to think about it is today, the sales leader notices a problem. At the end of the quarter, they notice, hey, there's this metric that we're not hitting. We're not performing the way I expected. Okay, let's think about a change to comp. Let's think about a spiff. Whatever it may be, they go and they model it, and then they pass it off to their sales ops team. And by the time it gets rolled out, we're talking, at an earliest, a month later that it gets rolled out. Maybe it's 2 months later. With Forma, we're using the data within the platform to notice issues with sales performance and the disconnection between what's the sales performance targets we want versus what the incentives are driving, to proactively inform the CRO and the sales leaders of gaps in their comp strategy, make recommendations, and the second that they go through the recommendations, because it's the same platform that's recommending the design and the strategy as it is the one executing, the second you say deploy that strategy, it automatically gets rolled out to the sales team. And so we're bringing agility in real time. So for some of our customers, a really powerful example of this is when COVID hit and everyone went into lockdown. For some of our customers, that was a overnight shift in their go-to-market strategy, right? Whether it's the Open Tables of the world, whether it's the Stryker medical companies of the world, all of a sudden, their world of operating looked entirely different. And so the speed to getting a comp plan out and changing the incentives behind what good looks like for the sales team was paramount. And these are global organizations that leverage Forma to roll out, iterate, test, financially model, and roll out comp plans with dashboards and performance tracking to their sales team within 1 week globally.
That's incredible. I mean, I assume that there's got to be some change management or, onus on everyone on the sales team to start implementing newer forms of data or more forms of data than they're already doing. So how do you get people to be willing to kind of push more data into the Forma platform? Or are you also using, APIs and stuff to pull from CRMs?
Yeah, so we connect directly into their upstream systems, whether it's CRMs, financial systems. We're collecting activity data all the way through to market data. So again, you can't set potential, or you can't set a quota without understanding what the potential is within that territory. So we're collecting that information as well. The interesting thing here is 15 years ago, there was this massive shift in the world of marketing, because the world recognized, okay, there's all this data that's available. How can we leverage it to tailor, whether it's ads, tailor communication, and drive the best result out of the marketing spend that we do? And yet in sales, we're kind of at the beginning of this next revolution. We have so much data that wasn't available to us even 6 years ago. If you think about things like Gong and the tools, the sales enablement tools, where we have data points in every stage of the sales process, all of that data today is not being used to inform sales comp strategy, and it's not being used to actually incentivize the sales team in the right way. And I think for our customers, it's just another data feed that goes into Forma that then feeds into the right design of comp strategy, the right outcome. And at the end of the day, it's the communication. You need to tie it back to the community. The rep needs to understand how they're getting paid and what they need to do to make more. And so I think we're just on this verge of a sales revolution.
Well, I assume with all the market and industry data that you guys are collecting, you're probably able to predict whether or not there's going to be a recession. So is there going to be a recession given the fact that the forecasting numbers in a lot of sales organizations is showing slower growth? Or are you not at liberty to share that information with our audience?
I think this one, it's a tough one to answer, because I don't think, even just outside of our customers' data, as a business ourselves, I don't think we're seeing customers change their buying mindset just yet to a significant degree where it's kind of a flag of recession. Although again, we're in a business where sales teams are kind of the last ones impacted typically in a recession. Your revenue engine needs to keep moving and continue scaling. But what I will say is we are measuring and paying on predominantly the results. And so results in sales are usually delayed from upstream activity. And so it could be something where in 6 months from now, if you ask me that question, maybe the data would tell us something different.
That makes a lot of sense. I got to assume you guys are eating your own dog food and using Forma internally to help build your own better compensation strategies, as well as communications to your sales organizations. And it's working, because with more than 400% revenue growth in 2021 alone, your company was able to recently close a Series B round led by ACME Capital, along with our good friends at Crosslink, Golden Ventures, and Uncork Capital. So first off, congratulations on the raise. And secondly, can you tell us a little bit about how the round came together and what has been the best part of having an amazing investor group like Crosslink and Golden in your corner from the early days?
So I had the opportunity of meeting every one of our investors in the cap table well in advance of the fundraising process. And so I think that's very much true for this last raise in the Series B. I have in the past not gone to many networking. I haven't done as many of the conferences or networking events, but I actually ended up going to the Goldman Sachs Private Innovative Company Conference in Vegas last year. And that's actually where I got to meet Brian from ACME. And it was great to have that dialogue well in advance of kind of running a fundraising process and actually just getting to know Brian at a level, and at a deeper level, and truly understanding everything that he'd bring to the table as a partner. And so I think that made the conversations much easier when we went into the fundraising process. In general, across my cap table, I mean, partners like Crosslink, Golden, X Fund, and Uncork. I think one of the things I'm most grateful for is, as a first-time founder, having individuals across the table that are eager to support and help me scale as a CEO and help the business by leaning on the resources and the individuals they have in their network to kind of guide and support. I mean, throughout the process since my seed round in February of 2020 until now, every one of my board members and individuals on investors have tremendously helped us in scaling this organization to where it is today.
That's amazing. I mean, who pushed you forward to try and go to the Goldman Sachs Innovators Conference in Vegas? Like, who was the one who said you have to go, or did you find it yourself? What was the impetus for that?
Yeah, it was Matt Golden. It's funny because I was, again, heads down. You're kind of in founder mode. You're heads down, focused on executing, and it was kind of in the middle of Q4 for us. And so obviously for me, I almost didn't go, and then Matt suggested that it was a great conference to attend and a great place to network with other founders and potential future investors. And I actually found it tremendously helpful. I mean, I met we were obviously an early stage company compared to the relative companies that are there, and I met some great founders that are now in my network and have supported me and have helped me in other ways. And I think it really is truly great to connect with other founders that have kind of been there, done that, and can relate the experience in a way where you can learn from their mistakes very quickly and apply it to solving the problems that are at hand for you.
Well, shout out to Matt Golden, and glad you listened to him, because it sounded like it worked out for everyone on the team. So thanks for sharing that. Before we wrap things up, we always ask our guests for their fast favorites. So first off, your favorite podcast. I
don't have a single one, and because it depends on the mood, but Lex Friedman, great variety of audience. And then I would say All In.
Second one, favorite newsletter or blog?
Morning Brew.
Nice. We've had Austin Reef on the podcast before. He was a great guest. Favorite tech gadget?
I have to say my new espresso machine.
Oh, which one did you get?
The Lilit Bianca.
Nice. The first person to recommend a good coffee machine on the show. I like that. Favorite new trend?
I don't know how new this is, because maybe it's in the last year and a half, but I'm in the city of Toronto, where everyone getting together is basically going to eat or drink. I think with the pandemic, I've noticed that the new trend is, getting together by doing something physical and doing something outside, whether it's going for a walk or, hike. And so it's great to see.
Absolutely. So living again and breathing fresh air is the new trend that you're excited about. I love it. Favorite book?
Again, hard to say single one, but I would say recently Amp It Up was absolutely great, and really enjoyed it.
Nice. And last but not least, your favorite life lesson?
If it was easy, everyone would be doing it.
Perfect. Short and sweet. Love it. Thanks so much for joining us in the tank today with Nabeil Alazzam from Forma.ai.
Thank you, Matt. Appreciate it being on.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Tank Talks. To learn more about this episode, be sure to go to Apple Podcast or Spotify to find more detailed notes on this episode, or to check out previous episodes. Also, if you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review and a rating, as it helps us out a lot. And hit that subscribe button so you can get notified when new episodes come out. Finally, make sure to give me a follow on Twitter @MattyBCohen or @Tank Talk Podcast to stay up to date on new episodes or to be a guest on our show. Till next time,